G'day friends, it's Andrew Goodall here again from Nature's Image Photography, and today I'm going to be turning 6 separate images into a merged panorama using Adobe Camera RAW. Before we get started, I want to invite you to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already to keep in touch with more videos like this and everything from my world of photography. So here's the photo I'll be showing you, and for people who aren't familiar with the idea of a photo merge, it actually began as 6 separate images and I used Adobe Camera RAW to blend them into one huge file. I'm going to show you the entire process from selecting the files through to saving the finished product for YouTube. Just before we start, if you like what you see, this image and plenty of others are available to purchase as a print or a variety of gift items from my catalogue on Redbubble. You'll find the link in the details below if you want to support me with a purchase. Big or small, they're all appreciated. First up, here are the essential camera settings for the original 6 photos. They were taken on the Panasonic Lumix G9 with the Leica Panasonic 12-60mm lens zoomed back to 12mm. ISO was 200, aperture f7.1 and the shutter speed was a 2/50th of a second. So now I'm going to take you to Bridge where the process begins, and you can watch as I create a merged panorama using Adobe Camera RAW. So like all my editing projects, the whole thing starts here in Adobe Bridge, and I'm going to be merging these 6 vertical pictures into one very large panorama. Before I do that, I'm going to just click on this one to explain why. So this shot was taken as a single image with my 12mm lens on the Lumix G9. That's the widest lens I've got at the moment, and really it just wasn't quite wide enough. The rainbow is very, very close to the edge on the left. There's a hint of a double rainbow just appearing over on the side there, but it's really disappearing out the side of the shot. And over on the right, the rainbow is disappearing out that side too, and this bit of gum tree up here is enough in the photograph to be annoying, but not in there enough to actually be a part of the photograph. So the widest lens I had just wasn't wide enough, and these are the reasons why we occasionally do these merged panoramas, and I'm pleased I had the presence of mind to do that. So I've taken these 6 pictures. You'll see there's a fair bit of overlap between each one. They say that you should have about at least 1/3 of your photograph overlapping the one before for these things to match up. I actually took 7 photographs, but well, there's just too much of what I don't want in that, so I'm going to work with the other 6. So the first thing I need to do to make this happen is select all 6 photographs. One click of the mouse will just select one photo at a time. But if I put my finger down on the control button on my keyboard and then select the images, you can see it's now holding on to all 6 pictures at once. And now if I right click on any of those and click open, it's now going to send the photograph across into Adobe Camera RAW, and that's where we can see the magic happen. Okay, so that was fairly quick. We're now in Adobe Camera RAW. I've still got my 6 separate files here. So what we want to do first of all is put them together into this merged panorama. Now, once again, if I click on any one photograph, it's only going to show me one photograph at a time. But if I put my finger down on the control key once more and click all the images, now all the images have been selected, and you can see this little symbol that keeps on popping up when I move my cursor across. Now if I click on the 3 dots there and go across to merge to panorama, this is the insanely easy part. If I just click merge to panorama, I get an almost immediate preview of the panoramic image. Now at this stage it is still just a preview. I have to come down here and click merge to actually lock all the pieces together. Before I do that, I'm going to talk you through a couple of the options you can see on the screen here, but I'm not going to touch them because when I did my practice run for this video, I found that at this point where the computer was trying to handle processing the massive number of pixels in this huge file, and also record this video and record my voice, everything started to break down at this point if I tried to mess around too much. So what comes up by default is how I'm going to go ahead, But just to talk you through it, projection gives you a few different options for how Photoshop merges the images together, and I find the spherical one, at least for this picture, is by far the most realistic, so that's the one I'm going with. I have the option to let Photoshop fill in the edges, so these empty spaces around the outside, Photoshop can fill in basically by cloning pixels from other parts of the photograph. But I did find, again in one of my practice runs, that areas like this where there's lots of detail, they tend to get a bit peculiar. So when it's trying to match up pixels from this area to this area, nothing really quite matched and it looked weird. So I'm going to get rid of the bits I don't want simply with an old-fashioned crop. So I'm not going to tick that. I can click Apply Auto Settings, and that would be letting Photoshop do an auto edit of the photograph, and the whole point of this is that I want to do it myself, so I'm not going to click that. So what comes up by default is what I want to go ahead with. I'm just going to click Merge now. Now the next thing is I have to save this, because Adobe is going to now save the merged file as a separate file in Bridge. So next to the 6 images that I've selected in Bridge, we're now going to have the panoramic version as well. So if I just click Save, I've now saved the raw file in Bridge, and now I get to work on the actual image. Now it's important to note that the merging has already been done, so I'm no longer working on 6 separate images, I'm working on one very, very large raw file. And as such, I can edit this just the same way I work on any raw file. So it's time to go to work in my usual editing programs, my usual editing routines, and the first thing I'm going to do, I think you probably guessed already, is a crop. I want to get rid of all those weird edges. So click my crop tool, and I'm going to just use the custom crop, which allows me to go with any dimensions I want. It doesn't lock it into a 16:9 or a 2:3 format, and I'm just going to crop it to where I think it looks balanced. When it comes to cropping, quite often you've got all the rules in the world, but sometimes I just go with instinct, and that's what I'm doing here. I want to get as much above the rainbow as I can. Let's go up to there. But I don't want to get any of that building over on the right creeping in, so I think that's about as far as I can go on the top right. I brought the bottom up a little bit already. I think it's looking fairly balanced, except that I think there's a bit too much wasted space over here on the left, so I'm going to pull that across, and I think that now is looking like a pretty balanced landscape image. So this is the picture I'm going to work with. So I click Enter on the keyboard, that locks my crop in place, and now we have a raw file to start editing. So at the moment my cursor is a magnifying glass, so if I click on that I go to full screen, and here we can go to work. Now most of my editing is done just in the basic area here, so this is where I'm going to start, and the first thing I pretty much always do is look at exposure and ask myself, is the photograph overall as bright or as dark as I'd like it to be? And I think it's looking a little bit on the dark side, so I'm going to bring exposure up, not a huge amount, and I'm not looking at all the details of the picture now. I'm just looking at the photograph as a whole and asking myself, is this now about as bright as I'd like it to be? And I think the answer is yes, so I'm going to stop there in terms of exposure. Now I'm going to work on the contrast a bit, and I start with whites and blacks. If I put my finger on the keyboard on the Alt button and then click down on whites, you can see the screen goes black. As I slide the white slider across, you start to see there where the brightest highlights come in, and you don't want to go too far. I just want to let the computer know that this is the limit of how bright I want pixels in my shot to be, so I'm going to stop whites about there. And I'm going to do the same with blacks. I click Alt on the keyboard, press down on blacks, and the screen turns white. Now I've got a little bit of tiny black over on the right hand side there already. I don't want too much, so I'm bringing blacks just a fraction across to the left, and that's told the computer now these are the brightest pixels, these are the darkest pixels in my photograph, everything else should fall in between. Now I've got some very dark shadows over here. Some of the areas down here are just a little on the dull side, so I'm going to grab shadows, bring that across to the right, and highlights, bring that down to the left just a little bit, not too much, because there's not really anything in that shot that's blown out or looking terribly overexposed. Now, even having attacked highlights and shadows and whites and blacks, I usually still go to contrast, and let's just bring the contrast up a little bit. I find that just livens the photograph up, gives it a bit more lifelike quality, a bit more three-dimensional sort of a look. But with any of these sliders, of course, you can go overboard if you go too far with these things. So I'll usually just bring contrast across just a little bit. I'll take it up to, well, where am I stopping there? About 17. And we can go down further here into clarity. Bring clarity up as well. It seems to work on the contrast too, but in a slightly different way. And I've also got a slider here called dehaze, which I don't use all the time, but there was a bit of misty rain still coming across when this shot was taken, and things were a little bit on the hazy side, especially over to the left there. So I'm going to bring dehaze across to the right a bit, and it just makes everything look a little bit more solid and real, and probably bring vibrance up a little bit too. Now, the combination of the clarity and the dehaze has probably brought the highlights up a little bit too much in this little area. I don't want this area to look washed out. That is the main highlight part of the photograph, so I'm going to pull highlights back a little bit further. The great thing about working with these sliders is you can always revisit them. So if you do something with one slider that affects something you've done elsewhere, you can always come back and take another look. I might bring shadows up too, just to sort of reduce the blackness of the shadow in that area. And already I think our photograph is looking pretty good. So at this point, you'll sit back and just take a look at the entire photograph and ask yourself if you're happy. And overall, I'm thinking this photograph looks pretty good. I might just bring contrast back a fraction. And now the next thing I'm noticing is this area on the left hand side. It's looking a bit pale and washed out. Yes, it was raining over there, but the sun was going down over on that side of the picture too, so it's brighter over there, and that's causing the photograph to look a little bit washed out. I don't want to make changes now that will affect the entire picture, so I want to work on this left hand side, and I'm going to do it using the graduated filter. Now, a graduated filter, the editing screen looks very similar to the basic screen, except that what it will do is only affect the area I select. Now, when I grab on the left and drag it across, stop it there, whatever change I make will happen at 100% where I started and 0 where I finished, and it'll gradually soften the effect as you go from left to right. So to show you what I mean, if I grab exposure and just take it all the way to one side or the other, you can see that it goes to 100% of what I'm doing right at the edge, and then less and less as it comes inwards. So obviously I wouldn't go that far, but I am going to bring exposure down just a fraction, maybe just to -10. Remember I said the sun was over there. Add a bit of contrast, add a bit of clarity, and maybe once again just dehaze that area just a little bit more, and it's just livening up that part of the photograph so that it doesn't look quite so washed out. I'm just trying to make sure the left hand side of the photograph doesn't look too out of balance with the rest of the image, and I think that gets that about right. So I'll get out of that area, and now the other thing I'd like to look at is the red soil down here. It had a really nice red late afternoon glow to it, which hasn't really translated terribly much into the photograph. So I would like now to take a look at that, and I'm going to do it using the adjustment brush. Adjustment brush is similar to the graduated filter, except now I can sort of wave a magic wand over the areas that I want to adjust, and it'll highlight just those areas. So if I click this mask up here, you can see now the area I'm selecting, and whatever changes I make now are only going to happen in the area I've selected. So let's just make sure I fill in the bits that matter. Okay. Unclick mask so we can see now what changes I'm going to make, and now if I bring that area up a little bit with the exposure, add some contrast, maybe bring the blacks down a little bit so that it doesn't look pale having brought the exposure up, add a bit of clarity, and maybe even a little bit of saturation. Not too much. It's all a balancing act, and it's all done just to satisfy your own eye. There's no definite right or wrong to any of this. Now I'm going to go back to the mask, and I think I could probably do with my little eraser tool. I've probably gone a little bit overboard. Just take some of that out of this area here. Okay, unclick the mask again, and all that's really done is brought out a little bit more richness in the oranges down here. Speaking of oranges, there's one more thing I'd like to do with colour to the overall picture, and then I might come and revisit this area down here. First of all, the one thing I haven't touched in the basic editing area is the white balance. Now, I've mentioned in my previous videos I tend to find that the G9 skews a little bit towards magenta. I never have very much success with the automatic settings in white balance. They tend to get a bit peculiar. That one's gone, I've clicked auto, it's gone a little bit towards the purple side. I don't like that. So instead of that, I'm just going to go back to as shot, and I'm going to grab the tint and bring it across to the left just a fraction to take out some of that redness that comes with the extra magenta, but I want to keep the late afternoon golden hour feeling of the photograph, so I'm going to grab temperature and slide it across to the right. Again, just a fraction, but just enough to give the picture that sense of a nice golden hour warmth. So it's a tiny bit. Once again, everything I do I try to do as subtly as possible. I want my pictures to be edited in such a way that people aren't going to look at them and think that I've faked something, so that's all I'm trying to do there. Now, I mentioned I was going to have another look at the oranges down here, and I've really done everything I can do in basic, so I'm going to shut that down, and I'm going to come down here to Color Mixer. Color Mixer allows you to work on individual colors, and well, not primary color, but the main color that I'm looking at down here is the oranges. So if I come across to luminance and just bring the orange slider across, it's just going to lighten up the oranges in the photograph, which is primarily this area down here. And I also, if I add a little bit of saturation to the oranges, it's just enriching that color. And I think what I'm trying to do there is get the color in the curve at the bottom here complement nicely the curve of the rainbow up here, and I think that's getting that balance just about right. So now I'm going to go back to basic and just see if there's anything else I want to do to that photograph, and really I'm pretty happy with that. I think I could probably do with toning that area down there just a tiny bit. So let's have a look at what I did over here, and it's just, I'm going to click the mask there, it's just overlapping into that area a bit and possibly making that part look a little bit bright. So I'm going to grab my eraser tool and I'm just going to erase that area to try to get rid of that extra bit of brightness up there. It's all a balancing act, and every photograph is different, so you have to work these things out to satisfy your own eye. So unclick the mask. I think that's looking a little bit better. So that, I think, is the photograph we're going to work with. All that remains is, if again I get out of here, shut down basic, is to work my way down through the rest of the tools. I'm going to look at detail. That's normally where I do the sharpening, and if there's any noise reduction required. To do both of those, you really should blow the photograph up to 100%, which I'm doing here, and find an area that's got plenty of good detail in it. And usually I'll grab sharpening and just drag it from the default 40 up to somewhere between about 50 and 55. It just sharpens the picture at the pixel level and gives it that little extra bit of clarity. I'm not going to mess with noise reduction because it's a 200 ISO photograph, so it's not a noisy picture. So I'll shut down detail. I'm going to come down to optics, which is where you find your chromatic aberration, and I'll click remove. I haven't really noticed any, but just to be on the safe side, I'm going to click remove chromatic aberration, and really now I think I've edited that photograph well and truly to my satisfaction. So all that remains now is to send it across into the creative side of Photoshop. I do that by clicking open, and it's probably going to take a few seconds to get there because again we're dealing with a very large file which has to now be transferred across into Adobe Photoshop. So I should have saved a little bit of thinking music for this part of the video, shouldn't I? But we're almost there. And now we have our photograph over in Adobe Photoshop, and it's time to do whatever little bit of finishing off I might want to do. Now, people who watched my previous editing videos will know that at this point I don't do a great deal, but I will go up into Image and Auto Contrast. This is one of those little things I use to check my work. If I click Auto Contrast and the picture looks better, then I go with that. If it looks worse, I undo it. So let's click Auto Contrast and see what happens. Now that has added a tiny bit of extra contrast, but really overall it seems to have brightened the photograph up, and I actually quite liked the slightly darker version because it had a nice moodiness to it. So I don't really like what happened with Auto Contrast. I'm going to click Edit and Undo. But it does tell me that maybe the photograph could benefit from a little bit of extra contrast, so I'm going to attack that a different way. I'm going to come to Image, Adjustment and Levels, and now I can adjust the highlights, the midtones and the very darks. So I'm going to grab the highlights and bring them across a little bit from right to left, and that puts a bit of extra highlight into the photograph, but I'm also going to grab the midtones and move them a little bit towards the right, and that's going to bring the darker parts of the photograph back to reality a bit. And I think what that does is keep that moodiness in the shot. It keeps the intensity in the mid-tone areas. The richer colors are coming out better, and overall it's also sort of increased the contrast between the beautiful patch of sunlight in the background and some of the richer colors around the outside. So I'll click OK, and I'm going to call that my finished product. So all that remains now is any resizing, cropping and saving that needs to be done. So let's take a look at that. First of all, I want to make this available for sale on my Redbubble catalog. So I'm going to save the picture for Redbubble, but I'm not going to resize it because the bigger the file I use in Redbubble, the more different products they can apply it to. So now I'm just going to click File, Save As, where are we? There we go. And save it on my computer, and I've got a folder on one of my hard drives which is just for pictures for Redbubble, so I'm going to save it in there. Now this is a Photoshop file at the moment. I want to save it as a JPEG, so click JPEG. It's got a file name already, so I'm just going to click Save. Save it as the highest quality JPEG I can, and that's done. So that is now saved for Redbubble. I also want to save it for YouTube, and in particular I'm going to need a YouTube thumbnail which fits the 16:9 format. So I need to crop it to suit that. Remember, when I cropped the photograph originally, I didn't crop it to any particular format, so now I need to lock it in. So I've got the crop tool enabled. I'm on 16:9, so now if I grab this and drag it across, it's only shaving off a tiny bit of the photograph, shaving away from the left, not the right, because I don't want to lose anything from the right. But that's going to lock it into a 16:9 format that'll make a perfect YouTube thumbnail. So I click Enter on that one, and I need to resize it because right now, don't forget, it's a massive file. So if I click Image and Image Size, it's currently a whopping 7,168 pixels wide. Now for YouTube, I always resize things to 2560 pixels on the long side. Click OK. Now that looks tiny all of a sudden, doesn't it? But if we view that at 100%, you'll see it's still a pretty substantial sized photograph. So now I click File, Export, Save for Web. I already have a folder already for this picture to go into to start preparing my YouTube video. So you can see there I've already got my practice run saved. I just have to click Save, and we are done. Okay, so there's my entire process from start to finish. If you've never created a merged panorama before, you might like to follow my example and give this a try. That's it from me for now, so before you go, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I'm Andrew Goodall, thanks for watching.